Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Amy Patterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. And with me today from staff are Yao Owusu-Darko, who is our project specialist and the program coordinator for this grant, and Erin Lefland, who is our new Deputy Director. And they will be, Yao will be doing the presentation, and Erin will be standing on the side with me to try and make sure that things go smoothly. But before we get started with this first session for the Connecticut Conservation Partnership Program, the info session, I just wanted to give you some Zoom ground rules for this particular program today. First, please stay muted. And if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat at any time, but we will pause for questions at certain points in the session. And at that time, when we do pause for those questions, we'll first start with those that are in the chat, and then I will ask you to raise your hand using the raise hand feature under the reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen, like this. Yeah, you want to raise your hand. When you are called on, you may obviously unmute yourself to ask your question, but when you're done, please go back, please mute yourself again. If there is any disruption today and we need to end the meeting, you can sign back in using your same Zoom registration link. Before we launch into our program, I wanted to give you a quick background on the Connecticut Conservation Partnership Program. Yeah, I was going to go into obviously all the detail, but we received this grant back in April, or announced the receipt of the grant award back in April of 21. And so there's been a lot going on. So I wanted to give you an update on that. In November of 2020, CLCC submitted a grant proposal to the USDA-Natural Resource Conservation Service Regional Conservation Partnership Program to create a funding and technical assistance program for land trusts applying to Connecticut Dept's Open Space and Watershed Land Acquisition Grant Program, or OSWA. Unlike the more typical NRCS agricultural programs, the funding source to which we applied for this program targets forest and watershed land protection, making the project criteria uniquely consistent with those of the OSWA grant program. We, as I just said, received great news in April of 21 that our grant had been approved in the amount of $6.7 million, and that will enable us to establish a 5-year program, which will provide land trusts applying to OSWA with a federal source of match funds for their projects. For the past year, we have been working with NRCS to put the necessary agreements in place with the federal government in order to be able to launch the program. So the first year essentially was taken up by those negotiations with the federal government. And I'm pleased to tell you that that negotiation is complete. We have the requisite agreements in place. And during that time, we did create a webpage with some information about the CCPP, which you all have hopefully had a chance to look at. And Yao, if you would put the link to that, please put the link to that webpage in the chat. And you could also find it going obviously directly to our website at ctconservation.org under programs. But with the federal agreements in place, now we will turn our attention to working through some of the essential steps with Dept in the Attorney General's office in order to proceed at the state level. So with all that said, the purpose of today's session is to provide you with an overview of the program, and with the next round of OSWA having just been announced, encourage you to consider this program, the CCPP, to help you as you plan for the funding of your transaction. You are entering at the ground level, and you may have questions that we won't be able to answer today, but your questions will really help us to develop the program as we move forward, and we will take any questions that we're not answering today and get back to you with those responses. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Yao Owusu-Darko, who again is CLCC's project specialist and the CCPP administrator. I will tell you that Yao was instrumental in writing the grant with me and in all of the work that we have been doing in partnership with NRCS to get us to this point. He's done a phenomenal job, and he will be your main contact for the program. I also want to mention that in the room today to assist in answering your questions regarding the federal program are the two Carols, Carol Grasses, who is the Assistant State Conservationist for NRCS programs, and Carol Donzella, who is the NRCS Realty Specialist. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Yao, and he can start in with the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Just going to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, so I'll start off this presentation with a summary of the program, then get into some detail about the easement options you can choose from and how CLCC will be coordinating the application process with NRCS and some of the things that we still need to put into place in order for this program to work well. After I go through each easement option, I will take a pause. I will pause to take your questions and or clarify anything you need me to. So the slides are numbered. So if you have any question on a specific slide, please note the number and we can return to that. So what is the Connecticut Conservation Partnership Program? So CCPP is a public-private partnership between CLCC and the CT Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, CT-Dept. It is funded by the USDA-Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we have partnered with Northwest Connecticut Land Conservation and Connecticut Farmland Trust to help us implement this project. CCPP is a 5-year federal easement program which enables land trusts that have or intend to submit an open space grant to Dept to apply through CLCC for federal match funds. And the projects that are considered under this program are forest and watershed lands and agricultural lands that are consistent with OSWA program criteria for farmland preservation. So who can apply to CCPP? So as mentioned, land trusts that have or intend to apply to OSWA, but also land trusts that have received an OSWA award notification, but have not yet closed on their project. So the easement options under CCPP are entity held easements and US held easements. In the following slides, I will describe the easements, the funding scenario associated with each, and some of the technical aspects of each. So what are entity held easements? Entity held easements are easements acquired and held by an eligible land trust in the case of an eligible entity. In the case of this program, that would be a land trust. So with entity held easements, we will be dealing with one funding scenario. In this funding scenario, a land trust seeks to purchase title through OSWA and partners with Land Trust B, the eligible entity, to hold the further easements. Land Trust B would then work with Land Trust A to apply through CLCC for NRCS funding for the easements. And at closing, the landowner will receive a combination of OSWA and NRCS funds. And the partnering Land Trust A and B, are responsible for the long-term stewardship and monitoring of the easements. So what level of funding can you expect for entity held easement? So NRCS will contribute between 25% to 50% of the easement value to the transaction. And this is subject to the CT general statute limits of 90% of a property's fair market value when combining states and federal funds. For entity held easements, NRCS will pay for these due diligence activities, appraisal tech reviews, and environmental searches. But Land Trust A will have to pay for all other due diligence and acquisition activities. This includes appraisals, surveys, title certificates, and insurance, and recording fees. But to complement this program, CLCC is developing a transaction cost program that will help land trusts pay for these different due diligence and acquisition activities. All right. And just to return to the level of funding, we have this slide. So to illustrate how this funding will work in the case of entity held easements, let's look at three different scenarios. So in the first two scenarios, there is no CCPP funding. So let's suppose a property is valued at $1 million. In scenario A, a land trust without OSWA or CCPP funded will have to raise that $1 million. But in scenario B, if the land trust receives the OSWA grants in the amount of $500,000, what they have left to raise is $500,000. With CCPP for entity held easements, again, suppose a property is valued at $1 million. And in the case of this easement, the easement is valued at $300,000. Under entity held easements, NRCS can contribute between 25% to 50% of the property of the easement's value. And let's suppose NRCS awards up to 50% of the easement value. So with OSWA and with CCPP, so OSWA grant, if the land trust receive an OSWA grant in the amount of $500,000 and a CCPP grants in the amount of $150,000, that combines to $650,000, and what the land trust is left to raise is $350,000. And again, this is subject to the CT general statute limit of 90% of the property's fair market value when combining the state and federal funds. So what would the process look like for applying to this program? So CLCC, we will hold a sign up and we will have an intake form for those interested in the program to complete. And this form will be specific to the type of easement the land trust is interested in. We will review projects for eligibility. We will complete their NRCS applications and eligibility documentation on behalf of the land trust. We will then rank, bundle, and submit the applications to NRCS. After we submit the applications, NRCS will review projects for eligibility, and this includes conducting title reviews and on-site inspections. NRCS will rank and tentatively select projects for funding. And prior to entering into any agreement with NRCS, the land trust must obtain an appraisal. And before the appraisal can be obtained, a draft easement deed must be prepared and submitted to NRCS for their review. So continuing, so for entity held easements prior to closing, land trusts are responsible for the appraisal, a survey, a management plan, a baseline documentation report, and title and closing work. While NRCS is responsible for reviewing due diligence activities and for an environmental record search. After closing, the land trust, the partner in land trust, steward and monitor the property. Next line. Okay, so things to work through. For entity held easements, CLCC is working with CT Dept and NRCS to create a consolidated easement template that includes both OSWA and NRCS terms. For land trusts, you will have to work through finding a land trust partner to hold the federal easement. And I'm going to pause there for questions. So share. Do we have any questions so far?
This is Margot Burns. I have a question.
Yes.
Let's see. Well, how does accreditation fit into this whole process for a land trust that might accept easements for others?
Okay. Amy, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, it's not, just as it isn't an issue for the OSWA grant program, it's not an issue for the federal grant program, other than if you're seeking accreditation, you'll need to work through the accreditation requirements and anything that they might have to say at the commission about holding easements for another land trust. But for purposes of eligibility as an entity for the federal grant for a entity held easement, accreditation is not required, nor it doesn't factor in any way.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to, before somebody else jumps in, I'm now going to go to some questions here. So Phil says, what does it mean to be a land trust partner? So the land trust partner would be the land trust that we keep referring to as Land Trust B that would hold the federal easement. Land Trust A is going to be, under the scenario that we just described, Land Trust A is going to be applying to OSWA for funding to purchase title to the property. But Land Trust A, as the owner, ultimate owner of the property, cannot also hold the easement on the property under the federal government's rules. Therefore, it needs a partnering land trust to be the holder of that easement. So Land Trust A would purchase the property, Land Trust B would, through using OSWA funds, Land Trust B would apply for the federal funding and be the easement holder. Those funding, the federal and the state money combined could be combined up to 90% of the price for the landowner at closing. Next question, can another entity besides a land trust hold the easement? I'm actually going to kick that over to Carol Grasses to address. Carol, would you mind talking about eligible entities under this program in terms of the entity held easements? Carol Grasses, are you there? I see.
Yeah, I am here. I was just looking real quickly. So the question is whether another entity other than a land trust could be the easement holding entity under the RCPP entity held easement section. Is that the question?
That's the question.
And I believe that as long as they meet the requirement for eligible entities, that is potentially an option. And typically the other kind of entity that has held our entity held easements has been a municipality. I mean, we've also obviously worked with the state of Connecticut, but I think they're not as interested in these forest and wildlife and wetland kinds of easements. They're really looking at the Department of Ag is really looking at those agricultural easements that we're not looking at in this program.
So I think that's one of those questions maybe we can park. And as we work through, provide a more detailed answer, Carol, to make sure that we're not sending anybody down the wrong road in talking with their town or another possible partner when ultimately it does need to be a land trust. So we'll park that one. I'm glad, Joan, that you asked that. Thank you. And thank you, Carol, for that. Ann Westerman asks, what is the incentive for the easement holding land trust to be part of the deal? And, you know, that's a great question. And we have been talking through that with NRCS throughout. And as you see, when we get to the US held easement section that Yao is going to go through, there are definitely elements of the US held easement program that might seem more attractive. But there are also elements that might not be. And so for the entity held easement program, the biggest benefit of it is that it allows partnerships between land trusts. And if there is a piece of property that is going to benefit a region, it gets land trusts starting to think beyond their town boundaries, which, as you know, is so much a part of what CLCC is doing with most of our programming, is really emphasizing landscape scale partnerships to have a greater conservation impact. And so it really fits very well with our mission to have land trusts partner with each other and work with each other. We are developing this transaction support program so that it will help defray some of the costs that are associated with the entity held easement so that it doesn't fall on just one of those or even both of those land trusts if they agree to share those costs. So we're trying to sweeten the deal with that as well. But the main incentive, Anne, is that it is really underscoring both the desire and the need for land trusts to be working with each other to protect land at a broader scale in their region. Next question is, what role can a municipality take in these projects? I think Carol started to answer that in terms of possibility of a municipality being the entity that can hold the federal easement in an entity held easement scenario, Kip. But also, I mean, like in any project, municipalities can always contribute money just as they would with just an OSWA project alone. They can be partners in that respect as well. So if there's costs that need to be addressed looking to a municipality to assist in that way, like you always do, would remain the same. Okay. And here's Carol has put in eligible entity criteria in the chat.
Oh, my apologies, Amy. I think I sent that straight to you instead of to everybody.
Oh, okay.
I can paste it into the
Oh,
to everyone.
Okay.
But essentially, yeah, the eligible entity would have to meet the sort of the standard criteria. They must have a program to hold easements. They have to have a history and a capability and record of doing that. And it does allow for state or local government to acquire conservation easements consistent with the purpose of the project that you're holding under RCPP. So I'll drop that in the chat, but it does allow for municipalities.
Thanks, Carol. And then the next question, and I don't see any others after this so far, so we can go back to the room for you to raise your hand. David, I see your hand is up. Is there a minimum or maximum property value to eligibility? I think I know the answer to this, but since you're here, Carol, do you want to comment on that with respect to the federal easement program?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Sure. Is there a minimum or maximum property value to eligibility?
No, as far as I know, there's no minimum. I mean, that would be looping in towards minimum size and things like that. So we don't have any restrictions on that. You know, I mean, the maximum would be, I guess, if we run out of money, you know.
Which will be a good problem to have. I will say that one of the distinguishing factors between this regional conservation partnership program that has allowed us to create the CCPP versus the traditional NRCS programs that I alluded to earlier is that this focus is on forest and watershed lands, which is why NRCS reached out to CLCC with the idea that we partner with Dept with OSWA, because the criteria will be the same. So we're not going to be mixing apples and oranges in terms of what projects we're looking at. We're looking at projects that are more typical OSWA projects in terms of forest and watershed land protection, with the farmland preservation projects that are allowable for OSWA funding. Anything above and beyond the farmland preservation projects under OSWA would not fit into this program. So that's why those minimum property size requirements that might be part of other NRCS or DOAG programs are not relevant here, which is a good thing, because it just, again, if you're moving forward with an OSWA project, you should feel pretty comfortable that your project's going to be eligible for this one as well. I think that's it for questions in the chat for now. So I'll go to David Bingham.
My question is about the easement holder, and clearly if this is going to be an ongoing project, and there are going to be a number of different applications that are going to need to be made for holding those easements. So is there money for staffing to do that work so that the land trust wouldn't be making an imposition on the easement holder that presumably is the one making the application?
So it's another question that we have been addressing as well, or just thinking about as well, as we work through these two types of easements that the land trust can pursue. And there's, the first response is that since, you're going to most likely need to fundraise for the project anyway. And so when you're considering where your sources of funding are going to come from, OSWA, this program, and you still have a balance to raise, because at a minimum, you'll have to raise the 10% to bridge the 90%, to bridge the gap between the 90% allowed and the 100%, then you would factor in stewardship costs and stewardship funding, just as you would with any project when you are doing your fundraising. And the land trust holding the easement should receive some, should receive money for those stewardship reserves that they would need to have. So that's one way. CLCC is actually working on, as part of this transaction cost program, we can't fund, at least with that funding pool that we're looking at, we can't fund stewardship, but we are looking at other possible sources of funding that we can then use to, again, sweeten this program so that there would be a source of funds to at least help in part with resolving resolving that issue. The other scenario that we were thinking about in terms of answering that question, David, is that, you know, again, with CLCC's work to help strengthen some of the regional hubs and some of the regional land trusts that are now in a better position to be a service provider to some of the smaller land trusts in the region, this would be a really nice role for one of those land trusts that is seeking that leadership position to say, okay, we will hold the easement for the smaller land trust. You know, maybe a staffed organization would be in a really good position to be the holder of that easement, to help with the monitoring for an all volunteer land trust that otherwise might not be able to close on a deal because they don't have enough money. And this program would allow them to do that. So again, as I said earlier, this is one of the ways that we're hoping to foster partnerships between land trusts. And we will do our best to bring as much money to the table as possible to make that happen. And not only through this program, of course, but through our other programs as well.
If that's the program that we want, it just seems to me that it would really be helpful to have one major easement holder. A lot of land trusts don't want to hold easements because in some ways they're more expensive because of the stewardship and monitoring responsibility of the easement holder. That it seems to me that you know, having the whole, all of our partners statewide focus on having somebody who's, you know, professionals at that, whether it's, you know, a statewide land trust like the TNC or whether it's a regional one like the Lower Connecticut River Valley Land Trust. It seems to me that to actually have a major organization staff that and get foundation funding for it would be something that would, so everybody would know who it would be to turn to as a potential applicant on their projects.
I absolutely agree, David. There's a couple of other questions here in the chat. How are we at time? It's 12:30. We're great. Gwen asked, please repeat who pays the cost. Does NRCS pay for appraisals? Is an A2 survey required? And if so, who pays for that? Yeah, do you want to pull that slide back up?
So yeah,
I have outlined that.
Yes. So for the first part to the question, who pays for entity house easements? The land trust pays for the appraisal, the survey, the management plan, baseline documentation report. Well, the land trust is responsible for these and the title and closing work. NRCS is simply responsible for reviewing the due diligence activities and the environmental record search. For the second part to your question, I'm going to stop share for a second. Is an A2 survey required? And if so, who pays for that? Carol, would you mind answering that?
Yeah, so our requirements for survey, I believe, are that the survey must meet the state standard. And since this is also going to be an OSWA deed, it probably would, I believe the state of Connecticut would require an A2 survey in order to meet the OSWA criteria. I think their criteria is more stringent than ours.
Yeah, that is correct, Carol, on the A2, that you're going to have to do one for your OSWA grant anyway. So that would be, you could use that for the federal grant as well. I also want to underscore what Yao had said, and I had just said it just a minute ago, in that we are going to be putting out a request for proposals for a new transaction cost support grant. And depending upon the demand, that will help us make the case for the amount of funding that we're seeking from a donor. So watch for that. It's coming soon. And even if you don't apply for this program, you can apply for that grant for your OSWA, to help with your OSWA costs. It's not, you know, it's not only limited for this program, but it will help when you are combining the two. I think that's it. Any other questions? Am I missing a hand anywhere? Let me
Yes,
look.
Sarah
Oh.
Williams.
Oh, good. Thanks, Yao.
Hi, guys. Yeah, I've got a question about sequencing. So just because you think an application is appropriate for an OSWA grant doesn't mean it's going to get funded. So I heard you're applying for both at the same time. And obviously, best case scenario is you get funded for both at the same time, but one is not dependent on the other. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
And the other point, glad you asked that question too. These are all really, really terrific questions. And that is, Sarah, let's say you have already been approved, like you just got your award letter from Deep on the most recent round, or you were approved last year and you haven't yet closed. You can still apply to our program to help bridge that gap that you need in terms of raising the money to close, but the timing then could be a little bit difficult because you're going to be starting fresh with this grant when you're already a year, maybe even a year into the OSWA program. And there's timing requirements for OSWA, as you know. But that's something when we start to work through project ideas with you, we would flesh that out. And we could talk to Deep about that scenario to see how the timing could work, if it could at all. One more question here. Would the easement have an end date? It's a Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are also perpetual easements like the OSWA easement.
Correct.
If there are no more questions, I will return to the slides. So the second easement option under CCPP is US held easements. And US held easements are easements acquired and held by NRCS on behalf of the United States. And there is, with this easement option, we also be dealing with one funding scenario. So a land trust A, seeks to purchase title through OSWA and partners with NRCS to hold the federal easements. So with US held easements, the landowner with assistance from the land trust applies through CLCC for NRCS funding for their federal easements. And at closing, the landowner receives a combination of OSWA and NRCS funds. The land trust owns title subject to OSWA and US easements. And NRCS, since NRCS is holding the easement, is responsible for the long-term stewardship and monitoring of it. So what level of funding can you expect from US held easements? And this depends on the easement's level of restriction. For the purposes of this program, we will be dealing with a moderately restrictive or highly restrictive easements. And with a moderately restrictive easement, the landowner can be paid up to 75% of the easement's value. And with a highly restrictive easement, the landowner can be paid up to 100% of the easement's value. And this is again subject to the CT general statute limit of 90% of the property's fair market value when combining state and federal funds. I'm just going to skip ahead to the next slide to illustrate this. So with this, so we know what happens without CCP. In the first two scenarios, the land trust either has to raise the $1 million, or if they receive the OSWA grants in the amount of $500,000, they will have to raise $500,000. With CCPP, in terms of US held easements, again, if let's suppose the property is valued at $1 million and the easement is valued at $300,000. The landowner can be paid up to 75% with a moderately restrictive easement or up to 100% with a highly restrictive easement. If the easement is highly restrictive, the landowner is paid 100% of the easement value, in this case, $300,000. Combining OSWA and the CCPP grants, we get $800,000, and the land trust is left to raise $200,000 as opposed to the $500,000 with just OSWA or the $1 million. Going back here. So with US held easements, NRCS will pay for the cost of due diligence and acquisition related activities. And this includes paying for surveys, appraisals, title searches, closing services, and other realty related services. So similar to entity held easements, for US held easements, CLCC will hold a sign up. We will review projects for eligibility. We will complete NRCS applications and eligibility documentation. We will rank, bundle, and submit applications to NRCS. After this submission, NRCS will review projects for eligibility. They will conduct their own title search and on-site inspections, and they will complete initial plan and activities, and these include cost estimates of the easements. They will complete an easement plan. They will gather information for a baseline documentation report. NRCS will then rank and tentatively select projects for funding, and will inform the landowner. The landowner will then review and accept the tentative selection. NRCS will pay for an appraisal to establish the easement's fair market value and make an offer to and enter into an agreement with the landowner. And NRCS will obtain and complete these activities: the boundary survey, the baseline documentation report, the management plan, and prepare the easement deed. After completing these activities and all other closing activities, NRCS will steward and monitor. Slide. So things to work through. I'll turn this over to Amy.
So before I answer this, I want to go back to the things to work through for the entity held easement, because this is what I was saying in my introduction, that you're getting in at the ground level. There are still some items that we need to work through now that we're focusing our attention to our partnership with Dept and some of the issues that we have to work through with them. So for the entity held easement, one of the benefits of going this route is that you will, and we're going to work on creating a consolidated easement. It's basically at this point looking like it's going to be the OSWA easement that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with some sort of addendum to it that integrates the required federal terms. And that will then be one document with multiple signatures that would be recorded at closing. And now, if we go to a US held easement, and this actually goes to a little bit to Ann's question about what's the incentive. Well, with the US held easement, one of the concerns that has been raised in the past, most recently, is that when you're dealing with two easements, the OSWA easement and the US easement, they have to be recorded, and there's a layering effect. So one easement is recorded first, and that would be the federal easement, and then the state easement would be recorded second. And the Attorney General's office has raised some concerns related to the layering of the two easements. And so that is something that we are aware of, and we are going to be working with Dept and the Attorney General's office to resolve that. It might take a technical correction to the OSWA statute, which we've looked at language. We don't think that's going to be difficult, but that's part of the process through the next legislative session. So it won't add too much time onto this underlying grant process, because we'll still be working through all the applications, et cetera. But it is a question mark that needs to be addressed. And so, Anne, to your question about what's the incentive? Well, there is an incentive to going through the entity held easement process, because that will be one easement. It'll be recorded at the same time because it's one document, and you won't have to deal with this US versus state easement issue in terms of recording. So those are two items that we need to work through. And now, again, since we are done with or at least to the point where we can turn our attention to working with the state on these issues, we'll proceed with that. And we'll keep you all posted on where we're at with that. And as you work through project scenarios and you're talking with Yao about, which way should we go, we will hopefully be able to provide you with information as we go along as to the status of these issues with respect to both types of easements. I hope that helps. Then there is a question here in the chat. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, thank you. And we could see some hands up. And I know that there are some of you out there who know firsthand about the layering issue that I'm referring to, and happy to talk more about that offline as you decide, again, which route you're thinking of taking. So Phil asks, can we get examples of moderate versus highly restrictive terms? Are these legal terms? Carol, do you want to address that and maybe throw in the chat? I know you have a link to a nice comparison of the highly restrictive versus moderately restrictive. And while Carol's looking for that information, I did put in the chat and above Phil's comment or question that whether you choose moderately restrictive or highly restrictive terms for your federal easement, no matter what, they will have to be consistent with the OSWA easement. So you can't have a term that is going to be, unacceptable to Deep and the Attorney General's office. Whether they're separate easements or one document, they have to be consistent. And again, because of the nature of these projects, that should not be an issue. Carol,
Right. So, yeah, as far as the moderately versus highly, so think of it in terms of the rights that are reserved versus the prohibitions under each of them. So under the moderately restrictive deed, the landowner would reserve more rights. So that includes, general quiet enjoyment, control of access, but there's also the ability to have existing structures that could be maintained, repaired, or replaced on the same footprint. There could be existing roads or utilities that are, again, allowed to remain and could be retained and used. There's more rights to have fencing and things like that, as well as general management. So kinds of things like timbering, if that was a goal, to continue to manage under a forest management plan or something like that. Under a highly restrictive deed, more of those rights would be transferred over to the United States. The landowner would reserve the right to quiet enjoyment and recreational use, but they would be prohibited from a lot more things. So prohibited from, haying, mowing, seeding, altering of the grassland, the woodland, harvesting of wood products, grazing or allowing livestock, any buildings or, putting in fences or roads or anything like that. So it's highly restrictive being a pretty good general term to describe that deed. I was looking for the document that you were talking about, Amy, and I'm not quite sure which one you're referring to. Was there a table that we had looked at one point that compared the two?
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we post that as one of the resources after this.
Yeah. It looks like Yao just posted a link to something on your CCPP page. Thank you, Yao.
Thanks, Yao.
But if you're familiar at all with NRCS easements, they frequently describe them as the moderately restrictive is more like an HFRP, which considers it to be sort of a working forest that is also benefiting wildlife. Is for that moderately restrictive kind of treatment, and the highly restrictive more like a WRE, where it's actually removed from a working lands kind of attitude, and it's really just conserving and preserving the land without doing a lot of management and going in and continuing to use it for any active use.
Okay, I see. Here's a question. From Margot, are there property size or resource values that NRCS will accept an easement for versus wanting another entity to hold it? So Carol, we'll pop that over to you.
Sure. So again, for property size, we have no limitations on those. We don't have any minimum or maximum sizes in our programs. As far as resource values, the resource values would have to meet the project goal that CLCC entered into that RCPP for. So I think that there were some specific resource concerns that we were looking at, habitat management and creation. I think, was there also a water quality one there? So again,
Yeah, and basically what we did was we made sure that the goals that we placed into the federal grant were the same as those that were in the OSWA program, so that there is consistency, there's complete consistency in terms of what we're hoping to achieve, thereby making it easier to reconcile the two easements. So if you look at your OSWA grant and you look at the questions in the OSWA grant and you look at the criteria that Deep uses to score your OSWA application, those would be pretty much the same, if not the same, as those that would be used to evaluate your federal grant application. Making it, you know, for those of you that are have already applied, your application was just approved, or you had a previous application still pending closing, or that you're considering applying, when you do your OSWA application, the information that you have to gather, which is extensive, we'll be able to take that information from you and plop it right into an intake form that we'll describe in a bit, to help move that process along for you. Our goal is to do as much of the lifting as possible for you when it comes to the federal application. I don't see a hand, but there's another question here. Can a municipality be the primary entity? Joan, I guess the way I would distinguish it is it's a land trust that's applying for OSWA that's eligible to apply to this program. They might, according to Carol's information, maybe a municipality can be an entity for an entity held easement. But if you mean the primary applicant, it would be the land trust. We wouldn't be, if a municipality is applying to OSWA for a purchase or either fee or easement, they wouldn't be looking to CCPP for funding directly, unless they can be a partner to the land trust that's the primary entity.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think there was one question we didn't cover. Are restrictions on US held easements greater than entity held easements?
The restrictions under the deed terms, so there's similar kind of language in the entity held easements and a differentiation between moderately restrictive and highly restrictive. I think the biggest difference in the deed terms is that for a US held easement, that the deed template is a national template. It is prescribed to us, and there are a few fill in the blank kind of spots where we can put in the conservation value statements and the name of the landowner and things like that. But otherwise, there is no modification of those deed terms at all. Whereas with the entity held easement, that deed, as Amy has said, is something that she's managing with OSWA, and there may be a little bit of flexibility in there to be more specific to a parcel, as long as it has the language of the minimum, the minimum deed terms that come from the federal side. But as far as moderate and highly, I think that they're basically the same kinds of levels of restrictions and prohibitions.
Thanks, Carol. There are a couple, I guess I missed. For monitoring and reporting, for an entity held easement, monitoring would be the easement holder. In that case, would be another land trust or another eligible entity, as the case may be. And that would be the same as handling, just like any easement holder. That's their responsibility, is to monitor, report, and handle the violations that are occurring on the property owned by the landowner, which in that case would be another land trust. So when you think about it, it's kind of a lighter lift when it comes to monitoring, because you're monitoring a land trust as a landowner versus another type of private landowner. For US held, the US government is responsible for monitoring, reporting, because they hold the easement, and they would then have to enforce, although there is, and this is a little bit nuanced, and we'll talk to you about this if you decide you want to explore the US held easement in more detail, but there are US rights of enforcement or non-US rights of enforcement. And depending upon whether those terms are in your easement, that will dictate the level of engagement of the federal government. But generally speaking, in a US held easement, since the government holds the easement, they would be responsible for monitoring and handling the violations. See, and then there's one question here from Margot. What do you see as the reasons why a land trust would choose NRCS as the easement holder versus another entity besides the layered state federal recording question? So yeah, putting aside the fact that, you know, if you have a US easement and the state easement, we have to work through that with the Attorney General's office to make sure that we don't hit any obstacles when we're getting close to closing. There's also, you know, in terms of evaluating which way to go, there's who's paying what expenses. If you go the US entity held easement, if you go the US held easement route, the federal government pays for everything pretty much, you know, and they pay a higher percentage of the easement value. But you're also dealing with the agency itself. Since they are handling everything, you need to go through them, their timeline, their review process, even more so than you will have to go through with an entity held. So timing and timeline will be extended if you go with a US held easement, but there are certainly some benefits to it, as Yao has described. With an entity held easement, you will be dealing with, the goal, of course, is to get one document that we will work on with Deep, and we're starting that process now, so that there'll just be one document, no layering issue. You still will have the issue of expenses, stewardship and monitoring expenses, like David had pointed out earlier. And again, you know, CLCC hopes to help with some transaction costs. Maybe we can get some stewardship funding, but that's just something that the two land trusts will have to work out together, including as part of fundraising for the project. The benefit again is with land trusts in regions looking to provide services to smaller land trusts, as David had really so perfectly pointed out, that we're really trying to make things more efficient and give smaller land trusts an opportunity to participate in these projects without having to worry about the capacity of holding an easement. So there are certainly, you know, there's been pros and cons to both types of easements. And when you start to evaluate your role in a region and you know, really towards you, Margot, as a regional land trust, that's something that you can factor in. Let's see. And could a highly restrictive easement coexist with OSWA's requirement for public access? And I'm gonna, you know, Carol, I'm gonna answer first, but please correct me if I say something inaccurate or if you want to add something. But, you know, in this is combining federal and state easements, as many, or federal and state grants, as many of you know, it's not something new. I mean, it happens a lot in Connecticut. Many of you have done that. I know many of you have, because I know the projects that you have worked on. And public access is required for OSWA easements. There are some cases where, especially if there's agricultural land involved, that Deep might allow for some limited public access in certain areas, but public access as a rule is required for your OSWA easement. The fact that the federal easement doesn't require it means that's not going to impact the fact that you still have to have it for OSWA. So in that regard, they will be consistent, because the federal government's not saying you can't have it. They're just not saying you have to have it, but the OSWA easement does. So you have to follow the more restrictive term, which would be the OSWA program.
And Amy, the only other thing I would add is, under a highly restrictive deed, is that deed is, from the federal point of view, is there to protect and preserve the conservation values. So if there was an area that was, you know, highly sensitive, we might seek to restrict, you know, public access to, you know, a vernal pool or something like that, if that was part of the priority of preserving that land. So as you get more highly restrictive, like you said, the landowner always reserves the right to control access. And so they reserve the right to prevent trespass, but also to control access and allow access by the general public if that's what they want. But with a highly restrictive deed, we would also, you know, maybe be looking at areas where we would try to direct traffic away from if you know, if it was a highly sensitive area. So it might be site specific on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that that's, you know, in every one of these cases, when you look at the terms, the first thing you're going to do is look at your property, and you're going to be making those evaluations as you always would with your OSWA easement. And if there is an area that is highly sensitive, even if you weren't applying to the federal program and you had your OSWA grant, that's something that you would sit and talk to Deep about, as you always do with your OSWA easements when you're looking to negotiate the terms. And by the way, with the OSWA program having the next round having been announced, we'll be offering a info session with Deep in July. So some of the questions that you might have about your OSWA easement that could be impacted by this, I'll be there for that. So we can talk about that in a little bit more of the OSWA context as well. David, there's a question here about, would invasive species control be allowed with highly restricted easements? Carol, can you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. Both deeds allow and actually require the landowner to be responsible for noxious weed control and emergency control of any pests. And then we would help to develop a plan to address that. So yeah, but it's allowed and encouraged under both moderately and highly restrictive.
Thanks, Carol. A question here, do you anticipate this will be a recurring annual opportunity? So this is a 5-year grant. And that's basically what we've been doing over the last year is figuring out all of how we were going to provide the services and the financial assistance over 5 years. So the first year is already done, just having worked through the federal process. And now we are ready to, you know, as we are today, just launch this and start to get the projects in the pipeline. And so we will have this program running for the next 4 years with the money being divvied up year to year. And if we run out of money before the 4 years is up, that's a good problem to have. And that means we can go back and seek more. We're not guaranteed to get it, but the higher the demand for the program, the better the chances and the success of the program, the better the chances are that we will be able to get more funding for it moving forward. So the answer is yes. It's an annual program for the next 4 years and hopefully longer, depending upon its success and the demand for it. What time is it? I want to make sure we're not running over time here.
1.
Oh, we're good. Great.
So I have,
Any other?
go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah, no, please.
I have 2 more slides and then we can take more questions.
Great. Thanks, Yao.
So what is the timeline for this program? And this will vary from project to project. So for those that have received an OSWA award but not yet closed, the federal process could take approximately 6 to 12 months. And for those that are applying for an OSWA grant, the federal process should be approximately the same as it is for OSWA. Let's skip this. So next steps. So for anyone interested in this program, please start planning your projects. Send Yao, which is me, any questions you may have, and review the project intake form, which will be available after July 4th. Watch out for an announcement. So once this intake form is up, please send me any questions you have about it. I will be holding Zoom info sessions, so you can request a time to meet with me and we can go over the intake form and anything else concerning your project. So yeah, contact me to set up a one-to-one consultation, contact potential land trust partners. And as we send out the RFP for the CLCC transaction cost grant program, please apply for it and respond to the RFP. This is my contact information. And we will take questions.
Thanks, thanks, Yao. So before I get to David's question, of course, I've lost my train of thought. What was I just about to say? Oh, I know. It was about the technical assistance elements of this. So as Yao had said earlier, the Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy and the Connecticut Farmland Trust agreed to be technical service providers. And their role will vary project to project. They may be providing CLCC with advice on how to address certain questions in the federal application or in the intake form, or they may be working with you as a land trust directly and the landowners with whom you are negotiating. So their role will vary and the level of their involvement will vary, but I did want to at least take a minute to acknowledge the fact that both, Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy and CFT, which both have extensive experience in the NRCS grant programs, will be available to assist all of us, which is terrific. And I think that was, there's some more questions. Let me figure out a way to see them. Here we go. All right. David Bingham asks, how do you measure success? Number of acres, number of projects, spending all the funds? I would say, I think it's more number of acres, David. When we applied, that was more of the measurement of success that we had put in the application. It's more about the quality than necessarily the quantity, and that would go to the number of projects as well. So I think we're really focusing on conserving the number of acres and using that as one of the measures, one of the main measures of success, as well as, again, the quality of the natural resources that are being protected through both the OSWA and the federal grant program. Spending all the funds, absolutely, that is our goal. The last thing we want to see is for Connecticut to have to give back federal money that's available to it. And we will work through these issues as we have to in order to make sure that this is an efficient and coordinated program, and that we are there to support Dept for the OSWA program, as well as all of you that are applying for this program. This is a very unique situation. We are really honored to have received this grant and really super excited because it's always our goal to provide you with the resources that you need to save more land at the end of the day. And so putting money directly into your hands is something that we have strived to do, and we really hope to make this program something that will efficiently do that, and so well that we can ask for more. Let's see. Yao, can you put you did, there's your info. Excellent, great. Anything else? So let me see if I've got anything here in my little cheat sheet. Let me see. So I guess I just want to remind you that we will continue to update you on the progress in developing both the consolidated easement for entity held projects, as well as working through the recording issues with the Attorney General's office and Dept in connection with the US held easement. If we have any meaningful success in that way, you will hear about it. We will be telling you. And that will help you, I think, decide which route to go if you're seeking to pursue funding through this program. We're having another info session, as you likely know, this Thursday at 6:30. Yao's presentation will be the same, but I'm certain the questions will be different. We'll have different ones. So feel free to attend that again if you'd like. But we will be recording that session, so you can always go back and listen to the recording on that. And any resources that pop up, needs for resources through that session, we'll make sure we add those to our webpage as well. Watch for the announcement regarding this transaction support grant. We're super excited about the opportunity to offer this to you. It had been part of our grant application, and when we couldn't get it done through the NRCS funds, we pursued a donor, and it looks like we will have some success in that regard. And so your demand for that program will help to drive our funding for it. And then also finally, look to the week of July 11th, when we will be working with Dept to offer the OSWA info session. That's all I have. So with that, if there's no other questions, I know you know where to find us. We hope to hear from you. Please keep your questions coming and project ideas. And I want to thank Yao, who has done an outstanding job from the very moment we opened that grant application, which was daunting, to this point in time, and we still have a lot of work to do. But I want to thank him for his assistance and his tremendous leadership in getting this project up and running. And thank all of you for being here today. We love working with you, and we're excited to bring this opportunity to you, and hope that we can be successful. So with that, have a great day, everybody.